Audio check. Right, okay, everyone. It's 9:30, so we can resume the inquiry on day, I think it's 9. Just a few housekeeping matters, if there are any, nothing from me, and then essentially, as I think everyone knows, today Inspector Young is going to be running the session virtually, and we've only got one witness, which is Mr. Brass, who's also going to be out there virtually. So we'll see how it goes and keep fingers crossed. Any housekeeping matters from any party? Yes.
Sir, just one point from us, if I may. You'll remember that Mr. Zero said he would update his tables to take into account that's the small issue.
Yes.
Relating to employment that we decided wasn't proportionate to pursue. Those tables have been provided, and they make consequently small differences to the bottom line, as it were.
Right, that's fine, thank you. Now, I have been handed the core documents that are going to be referred to possibly in examination in chief. I don't know, Mr. Young, have they been emailed through to you? They have, that's great. Yes.
So you know, as previously, I doubt that we will go to all of them, but if we did go to any of them, you've got them there, you can see what it is, and
yep.
We just thought it made it easier.
Yep, it's certainly helpful. No, that's excellent. Okay, then without further ado, I'll hand over to Mr. Young just to introduce himself if he needs to, and then we can start proceedings.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Let me just check that the technology is working. Am I coming through loud and clear? Excellent. Now, let me just see. I've already seen Mr. Humphreys, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Brass, do you want to turn your camera on so I can see you? Excellent.
Yeah, I've done so. Hopefully you can hear me as well. Is that it? Can you hear me okay?
I can. Can everybody in the room?
Yep, that's coming out okay in the room.
Excellent. Right, well, in that case, I'll hand over to Mr. Humphreys.
Thank you very much, sir. So we have Mr. Brass again, this time to deal with socioeconomics. So I introduced Mr. Brass last time. His qualifications and experience on this proof have perhaps slightly more emphasized the socioeconomic inputs to the appeal documentation, but unless you want me to do so, I wasn't going to get him to go through again all his experience. That just seems to me completely unnecessary.
That's fine.
Mr. Brass, I want to start by taking you through a few general things, then try and identify with you the principal areas where there seems now to be some measure of agreement with some other parties, and then I'm going to try and focus on those areas where there does seem to be disagreement, and get your views on those particular things. So just by way first of context, in your proof of evidence, and in particular in section 3, you have set out the national, regional, indeed local policy context for your evidence. Can you just explain to the inspectors first why that's important?
Well, good morning, Mr. Humphries. I think probably in some ways it's the starting point for everything. It is sort of vital to understand the policy context in which we are operating. I mean, ultimately, national, sub-regional, regional and local level policy are all strongly supportive of airport growth to support economic benefits and economic growth in the economy. I mean, I won't go through Section 3 in any great detail. I think we've been through many of those points before, and I think obviously we can do if people wish to, but I mean, I think they are largely self-evident, and I've set them out quite clearly there. I mean, I think an important point to note is the policy is very much about, an aviation policy very much supports the importance of growing aviation to support the economy. And I think it's possible to see from its all national, regional and local economic policy that growth in jobs from growth in economic activity is very important. And there's a very strong focus on the international economy, the Global Britain agenda particularly, and even within the West England industrial strategy also makes very clear the importance of the international economy, the importance of investment, the importance of tourism. And again, it also obviously highlights the links to the airport and how the airport is an important asset for the area. I think it's also important in terms of the levelling up agenda. I know we've talked about the levelling up agenda quite a lot already in this inquiry. And I know Mr. Surrey made a number of points about sort of disparities in terms of different areas within sort of the South West and South Wales area particularly, and how that some were seen as more deprived, for want of a better word, than others, and more in need of levelling up. I accept his point that there are areas of different levels of deprivation, different areas of different needs in terms of levelling up. But I think there's a fundamental point here which we ought to make, which is that actually it is about levelling up. The clue is in the title. We are trying to bring everyone up to the same level. It's not about levelling down and constraining others to benefit less deprived parts of the world. I think that is an important point to make, and I think that's a key thing I'd like to point out at this point. Okay. But generally, I think the main reason for this process is the start of everything. It is about economic growth, airport supporting economic growth, and how the international economy is going to be important to Britain and its regions and locally going forward.
And in relation to the evidence of Mr. Ciro and the Dr. Chapman, how would you characterize the way in which they have dealt with policy or framed their evidence in the context of policy?
I was to take Mr. Ciro first. I mean, I think he has pointed out some points in relation to North Somerset, but ultimately the analysis is fairly limited. I mean, for instance, he just ignores the rest of the West of England completely. I think perhaps the most obvious point here is all his map of the index of multiple deprivation, which clearly shows the areas of deprivation in Weston-super-Mare, which he comments on quite rightly, but ignores the large areas of deprivation in South Bristol, which is pretty much equidistant between the airport and the airport is pretty much equidistant between Weston-super-Mare and South Bristol. I mean, I think I've made this point on page 50 of my rebuttal proof, just circling the areas. I think I should circle the areas in Weston-super-Mare, and I've circled the areas in South Bristol. I mean, otherwise, I think he's looked a little bit at North Somerset's tourism, but tourism objectives. But frankly, there are other areas in the west of England, particularly, that are important tourism destinations. The city of Bristol is one of the most visited cities in the UK. I think Visit Britain reckons it's about the eighth most visited city in the UK. And obviously, other parts of the southwest are also significant tourism destinations. So overall, I think it doesn't seem to be something that's paid a lot of attention to. I think it's quite a selective assessment. I mean, I think he did bring out a bit more in evidence in chief. He did talk about the levelling up agenda, but I think, as I've just said, I think there is this important point about it being levelling up and they're not levelling down. So I think overall, the assessment was fairly limited. I don't think it's covered the sort of the main areas that it needed to, but it doesn't really get across this point that actually there is fundamental policy support for airport growth to support the economic benefits that it brings.
Okay. And what about Dr. Chapman?
Oh, sorry, I've just come to Dr. Chapman. In Dr. Chapman, I think I'm not sure he passes any comment on any of this at all. I think, I mean, as we sort of discussed on Friday with Dr. Chapman, it doesn't seem to be an area he has a particularly strong view on or a particularly strong knowledge about. I mean, I think what is probably worth saying is that both Mr. Serra and Dr. Chapman both actually appear to agree with a lot of the things that are said in these policies. They haven't covered them, though, and they haven't taken them into account.
Mr. Brass, I'm going to just ask you, I'm going to move on to something slightly different now, but I'm just going to ask you to very slightly slow down. It's no criticism of you, but I think a consequence of the virtual format and the fact that your voice then is obviously going through through the internet makes it just slightly difficult or more difficult to follow you. So just ask you slightly to slow down.
I apologise at all. As you say, the virtual environment is slightly strange from that point of view.
Don't worry. Now, I'm just going to get you to try and go on to deal with those areas that are agreed, and we've also had the additional tables which you may not have seen this morning from Mr. Ciro on that. Let's just start at the very highest level, the sort of strategic effects. To what extent is there agreement that airports do bring economic, socio-economic benefits?
I think based on Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman's evidence in chief and my own position, I believe we are agreed in that area. I think the fundamental point that airports bring economic benefit is a point of agreement between us.
And then if we begin to just sort of slightly break things down to see where there is absolute agreement and where there is some degree of divergence, did you get, I don't know whether it was circulated electronically, Mr. Ciro's update to his tables?
I'm afraid I have not seen that as yet. I haven't received it.
Don't worry. We can see in that document, it's the revised table 5.3, which is an update of the previous version, that Dr. Ciro has accepted the appellant's net impacts, the GVA, the jobs, the FTEs for North Somerset, West of England, South West and South Wales. He makes a productivity impact deduction, which we will come back to. That's the sort of...
Sorry to interrupt, but that's not correct, what was just put.
Oh, sorry.
You can see the Jacobs revised net impacts for North Somerset and West of England, table 5.3, in the fourth row down.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I said he agreed those figures, but he's made an adjustment for productivity impacts, which is what I was just pointing out.
It may just be that I misheard, Mr. Humphreys.
Sorry?
Forgive me for interrupting then, I must have misheard. So the
top line is our figure. He's made an adjustment for productivity impacts, which is, if you like, the shorthand, the business connectivity issue,
Yes.
his balanced approach and his optimistic approach. But for the next line down, job intensity, i.e. the numbers of jobs created, there isn't an adjustment there. So that gives us some indications of where there is agreement and where there is disagreement. So first of all, on the direct, indirect induced jobs for North Somerset, West of England, and South West and South Wales, those job impacts. Where has the ball stopped rolling on all of that?
Mr. Serro and I agree on those things at a gross level, which I think is important to point out. Dr. Chapman believes that while the growth at the airport will increase those things, he does not agree to the extent of increase.
And the business productivity benefits, as they're sometimes called, or productivity impacts in that table 5.3, there's an issue there between you and Mr. Siro, but can we just characterize what that difference is and what it isn't?
Yeah. I think the point that we've got to is that if the number of business passengers at the airport is the same, then the business productivity benefits will be the same. The point of disagreement at the moment is the future number of business passengers at the airport. That means that we have agreed essentially the Oxford Economics relationship, the 10% to 0.5%, which then the business productivity effects are derived from. The difference lies in essentially the business traffic forecast. It is not in relation to the business productivity assessment.
And is that there was a debate I had with Mr. Foley about that and the econometric modelling, the figures we'd used, and then Mr. Foley's table, I think it's INQ, it's either 10 or 13, I can't remember, but the one that has the yellow shaded columns and looks at trends in business and leisure growth over different periods of time. Is that in essence that dispute?
Essentially, yes. The dispute remains around the number of business passengers in the future, or the proportion of the total at 12 million.
And in relation to tourism, we know there are differences about the treatment of outbound tourism, but what about inbound tourism?
Neither Dr. Chapman nor Mr. Siro has raised any challenges around inbound tourism, so my assumption is at that point that we agree those as well.
So those are what, if you like, some of the kind of gross effects, and we've characterized what's agreed and what we believe is not agreed. Displacement and net effects, just again set out there what seems to be agreed between the parties about displacement.
Okay. I think the fundamental point that displacement is uncertain, that there's no set approach to examining it, or indeed to dealing with it. Myself and Mr. Siro agree with that in evidence in chief. I'm not sure Dr. Chapman's actually stated his position on the level of uncertainty, but I think from what he said within his evidence, he would agree that it is an area which is clearly uncertain, and that there are different approaches to it.
And then can we just consider changes in location of economic activity? I think in your evidence it's sometimes called product displacement.
Yeah.
Where have we got to on that?
Okay. I think it's certainly helpful perhaps to try and consider displacement in almost in two lumps, as it were. In terms of product displacement, i.e. The extent to which, if passenger demand moves between airports, what that does to economic activity. I think we've all three parties have taken slightly different views on how to address this. I think Dr. Chapman and myself seem to take a similar sort of conceptual approach to sort of direct and indirect and induced effects, in that we've assumed that that the movement of passengers results in the movement of activity to the other airports. So if Bristol can't grow to 12 million, some of that passenger traffic goes to Cardiff, then the direct and indirect and induced effects associated with that activity move to being around Cardiff Airport.
Just pause there for a moment. We had again these updated figures from Mr. Ciro this morning, but you remember his earlier revised document. He had some tables which I took him to in the earlier version where various assessments were made of if demand was not met at Bristol, where else would it go within various areas? And there were percentages for Cardiff and then percentages for Heathrow, Gatwick. And so is that product displacement?
That is my understanding of that element of Mr. Ciro's approach. He seems to take a slightly different view. He's looked at it in terms of where passengers are travelling to or from, rather than it being related to the airport, the location of the airport.
Yes. And then, as well as product displacement, there's also the concept that if demand is not met at Bristol, then people may not fly at all, but they may do something else or spend their money in some other way. Again, to what extent, with both Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman, to what extent is there any agreement on any of that?
I think it's fair to say it's probably the major area of difference in terms of displacement between the two parties, so three parties rather. Essentially what we're talking about, as you rightly said here, is that if some demand is lost completely, essentially if Bristol doesn't expand, it no longer flies, there's what happens to the economic activity relating to that growth. Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman have essentially said that it will be reabsorbed back into the economy. People will do something else. Some other form of economic activity will come forward instead, and the resources will be used for that. My view is somewhat different. I do not believe that you can simply assume that the jobs will simply be reabsorbed at a regional level. So I have not allowed any displacement of that nature, as I do not think it's an appropriate consideration in relation to private sector investment.
Fine, so that's displacement. If we move on to outbound tourism, and again, we're trying to identify if there are any areas where there seems to be agreement. We'll certainly be coming on to disagreement. But in relation to agreement, to what extent does there seem to be any agreement there?
I think the area of agreement is that we all accept that there are welfare benefits that stem from outbound tourism. People do actually fly on holiday or whatever it might be for a reason. They pay for that and they get a welfare benefit from it. However, obviously there are significant areas of disagreement. In my view, outbound tourism is unlikely to be significantly negative. My view is that there are two sides to outbound tourism. There is the spend that goes overseas, but there are offsetting effects, and there are positive benefits in GDP terms and in terms of welfare, which mean that it is unlikely to be significantly negative. I'll also point out that the government policy obviously makes clear that there is no evidence to suggest that outbound tourism has a negative impact on the economy. Mr. Ciro's position is, I suppose, somewhere between mine and Dr. Chapman's. Mr. Ciro's calculated the negative effect, and I think sets out that people should be aware of what that negative effect is.
Mr. Brass, just slow down again very slightly.
Sorry. He has quite explicitly pointed out that it's not an argument to restrict travel, but to be something to be aware of. And as I've already said, he does recognise that there is a welfare benefit to outbound tourism. Dr. Chapman's position is that outbound tourism should simply be included, and he obviously calculates a figure, but he does again recognise that there is positive welfare benefits associated with outbound tourism.
And I think I put the point to both witnesses that in effect, passengers would pay for their trip something at least equivalent to the socio-welfare benefit which they derived from that trip. And I think both Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman agreed with that proposition. What's the importance of that?
It's back to this point about there being a welfare benefit. Ultimately, people are paying for something, a holiday. They are gaining value from it. It is not like they are simply shipping their money overseas and not receiving anything in return.
Right. Final area where I want to see the extent to which there is agreement in the economic impact assessment addendum. There is a cost-benefit analysis. It says, in relation to it in terms, it is not a web tag analysis. But I just want you to, again, tell us to what extent there appears to be agreement or disagreement in relation to that.
Certainly. Myself and Mr. Ciro, I think, agree on the components that are there. But Mr. Ciro says that there should have been a noise and air quality assessment included. And he has also stated he would like to have seen low and high carbon sensitivities in relation to the carbon costs within that cost-benefit analysis. Dr. Chapman, I think it's fair to say that we have a range of areas of disagreement. I won't go through them now, but there are a number of areas of disagreement there. There's a limited areas of agreement.
So what I'm going to do now is begin to focus again on those same areas, but focus more now on where there is the disagreement and what you say about that. So if we start with the employment, the direct, indirect, induced employment, and GVA, and so on, we've touched on the fact that you and Mr. Ciro agree on those figures. One of the points, though, that Mr. Ciro made, and indeed I think Dr. Chapman made the same point, but it was first Mr. Ciro, was access to those jobs. Would people in deprived areas of Weston-super-Mare and South Bristol actually be able to get access to those jobs? And what's your position on that?
Well, I mean, I think access was raised in two senses. The first was in relation to having the necessary skills and knowledge to be able to access jobs at the airport. And I think we highlighted that obviously the skills and employment plan, which is being put forward as part of the appeal proposal. And I think from memory that both Mr. Sirro and Dr. Chapman welcomed that plan and felt that it was an important thing to be doing in terms of helping to people access those jobs in that respect. The other point that was made was more about physical access in terms of actually physically being able to get to the airport to work. I think I would make a number of points here. First of all, both South Bristol and Weston-super-Mare, which are the areas of sort of deprivation that we're talking about in particular here, they're both already sources of labour for the airport. People do travel there and they do work at the airport now. So clearly it is possible for people to do so, and indeed it is clearly desirable for them to do so in comparison to other things that are open to them. The second point I would say obviously is that coming along with the appeal proposal is a number of sort of transport measures are being discussed at present, which does include enhanced public transport access, which would improve access from those areas. I'm obviously not a transport expert and cannot comment in great detail on those, but my understanding is that they are going to be able to improve public transport and therefore enable people to access those jobs more easily. And I would also say, obviously, in relation to almost current arrangements, as it were, there are already subsidised public transport arrangements for reaching the airport, and those are used by staff now.
And then, again, still on the jobs, Dr. Chapman, Mr. Sirro did agree the numbers of jobs. Dr. Chapman didn't. How do you characterise his position and what do you say about it?
Dr. Chapman's position is that the appeal proposal doesn't allow for sufficient growth in productivity at the airport site, and that therefore in the future there will be less jobs than we have estimated. I mean, there's a number of points here. I mean, for a starting point, Dr. Chapman has made a similar error to Mr. Sirro originally, in that he started from the wrong employment density. But even allowing for that, he's still suggesting a higher rate of productivity growth than has been used in our assessment. I mean, I think I'd make a number of comments at this point. I mean, I have to say that one or two of the things are slightly unclear about what exactly Dr. Chapman suggested, but I'm going to try and make the point anyway. I think he seems to have based his assessment of future productivity on an assessment of how productivity has grown in the air transport sector over recent years. Unfortunately, the air transport sector isn't actually representative of the sectors that are on site at an airport. I mean, I know that sounds a little strange, but it is the case. It only covers airlines, the airport company, and some ground handling. It does depend exactly actually on what definition Dr. Chapman's used, and we don't actually know. But in terms of the publicly available data, which I think he has used, you cannot isolate properly all the activities on site at an airport. You can't get at things like on-site retail. You can't get at things like hotels properly. You can't get at car hire. There's all sorts of activities that go on site at an airport. You can't actually observe properly through that process. So his productivity assumption is based on something which is not actually a reflection of the airport as a whole. I will also say that his analysis has gone similarly to how we talked about the greater growth of business travel and the balance between business travel and leisure travel. His analysis has gone over a period which covered the low-cost bubble, which, as we've discussed before, is a significant distorting factor. We were seeing the growth of low-cost airlines massively over that period, who have brought in a lot of efficiencies into the airport sector. Undoubtedly, I don't think anyone would deny that. But we're not expecting that sort of growth again moving forward. We're not expecting that sort of massive change in the airline market particularly, and then knocking on into the airport sector. It's therefore not appropriate to use that sort of that productivity growth rate, which includes that period. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, I think, to be fair to Dr. Chapman, he does actually recognise some of these issues. I mean, if we just sort of have a quick look at his proof of evidence at paragraph 6.2.5, if I may. He says that as an airport increases in size, its employment intensity will generally fall, as it is able to make efficiency saving on a per passenger basis. In 2018, Bristol Airport provided 453 jobs per million passengers per annum. As I pointed out, the baseline is slightly off, but nevertheless, the aviation sector at large provided around 454 jobs per million passengers in 2018. Although this figure may not be directly comparable due to variations in how airports account for direct employment. As far as I can see, he is actually pointing to this problem about SIP code definition. You cannot actually really define an airport in the same way via SIP codes.
And
I've also...
Sorry.
I
was going to say, and in that regard, how would one characterise Bristol Airport? And it's been said on a number of occasions that it's has a high proportion of low-cost carriers. We've seen its growth over time. How would you characterise the airport in terms of efficiency?
I think, as we've said before, I think ultimately Bristol Airport is a very, very efficient operation. It is a very high level of low-cost carriers. It's operating at around sort of 470-ish jobs per million passengers per annum. That is an efficient airport. There is not a lot of slack there to reduce density much further, as Mr. Ciro has clearly recognised. So to try and apply a productivity factor which covers air transport across the whole of the UK to an efficient airport on a slightly different basis is not really an appropriate way to work it out.
Okay. So that's dealing with jobs and job growth, both direct, indirect, induced, and so on. I want to move on now to the next area where we know there is disagreement. This is business travel and the benefits of business travel. And in Mr. Ciro's table, this is his table 5-3. This is the line he has for productivity impacts. This is his balanced approach and optimistic approach, where he thinks there are lesser benefits, indeed in the balanced approach, no benefits in terms of business connectivity. So just explain to the inspectors there what the differences are between the parties and what you say about both Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman.
I mean, I think there's an important point to start off with, that I think Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman have slightly misunderstood the analysis that's been undertaken. The analysis is not about individual business travellers. It is about the connectivity offered by an airport. And the business passengers are simply a reflection of how connected the airport, the areas around the airport are. I mean, this is an important distinction. I think the Oxford Economics relationship on which our analysis is based, refers to a connectivity index. It refers to the relationship between connectivity and productivity and GDP in the economy. It's using business passengers and the level of business passengers within the UK as a basis for understanding the extent of connectivity. The reason this is important is that it's not just the business passengers that are lost through any constraint at Bristol, they're the ones that lose out. Our original analysis back to the baseline looked at passengers that are, so business passengers that are purely dependent on Bristol. It allows the fact they may go somewhere else. The implication of this is that even if they're going somewhere else, they are using another form of travel. The area around the airport is still less well connected, and that there are there's less impact there because others who may still be travelling are still losing out. Their travel may be less convenient. If they have to travel somewhere else, it may take more time, it costs more, it takes more distance, it's just simply further, it's just simply less convenient. Travel may be more costly. They may have to go to another airport where the flights they are looking at are more expensive. The destinations they need to travel may not come forward. The additional frequencies that which might improve the convenience of their travel and make them be able to, for instance, make a day return business trip from Bristol may not come forward. So they're losing time that way. Businesses may actually just simply never locate in the area around Bristol Airport because it is constrained. These effects are not just about the individual travellers we see being lost. It is about this overall point about connectivity.
Just explain that point in relation to North Somerset Council's Junction 21 development.
Certainly. I think what we're saying here is connectivity pervades across all of the economy. Anyone who needs to travel internationally has an interest in the connectivity offered by Bristol Airport to some degree. Connectivity benefits are incrementally making lots and lots of people, lots and lots of companies better off and more productive. In relation to Junction 21, for instance, which, as we've already seen, we discussed in my forecasting proof and indeed in my forecasting evidence in chief, is a major enterprise area which is seeking to attract global and national companies to come and locate in North Somerset. It's making a point about the importance of Bristol Airport as a gateway to the area. It's making a point about the destinations that are served from Bristol Airport. It's pointing out this convenience factor. This is why it's important. So, if they want to attract people to come and locate at Junction 21, Bristol Airport and the growth of Bristol Airport makes it that much easier. Yes, people may still come. Yes, they still may be able to apply from somewhere else. Yes, they may be able to pay for use services from Bristol, but at a potentially higher cost. The effect is affecting incrementally all the way across the economy. Those people who do come and locate at Junction 21 will just simply find life harder and be less productive. Or, in some circumstances, they may never come at all. If that connectivity is not there, they simply may not come.
So how is that type of point taken on board in Mr. Ciro's, his balanced and his optimistic approaches?
I think obviously taking, I suppose, the easy one first, the optimistic approach. Obviously, we disagree on the passenger numbers ultimately, but we agree on the relationship. So, to some degree, it is there. He has understood it from that point of view. I think it comes more into play when we're talking about displacement in some ways. However, for the balanced approach, it doesn't really sit. It just ultimately seems illogical. He's saying there will be no growth in passengers in the future. Okay. fine. We clearly don't agree with that. But he's also saying ultimately that there is no impact on this. We've constrained an airport and made life more difficult for companies around that airport, but there is no impact. We've made everyone's lives harder. They've got to travel further to go and do things. They may not be able to access the destinations that they need. They don't have the convenience anymore, but apparently that has no effect. It just doesn't seem logically consistent or to work out in a sensible way. And it ultimately just doesn't fit with sort of the economic policy background here either. We're looking at economic policy which is pushing us towards a global Britain. We're looking at local economic policy, which is emphasising the importance of foreign direct investment and emphasising the importance of the international economy. It really just doesn't fit with that position. It also doesn't fit with the population growth that we're expecting. We're expecting population growth. We've seen that already in the forecast. We're looking at about 8 to 9% in the west of England and the southwest. There are going to be more people around. They are going to be they are going to need jobs. Some of those jobs are likely to need to require international travel. It just doesn't really fit.
So how does this fit with the point you made earlier about, look, businesses may just never locate in the area in the first place?
If the connectivity is not there and they do not come, there are no jobs there. You will lose. It's as simple as that.
Move on, still in these business travel points, but slightly different point. The various claims, not just from Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman, but in fact others at different stages during the inquiry so far, that business travel just won't recover, and therefore, in some sense, the additional to capacity at Bristol is just unnecessary, not needed. Just explain your position on that, please.
Well, I mean, I think obviously we've talked about this quite a lot already in terms of the traffic forecasting. Our position is that that our forward growth rates for business travel have been developed via an econometric model. We believe that to be robust and we believe it to be sensible. It is ultimately driven by growth in the economy. GDP will grow. It will generate opportunities and the need for international travel, as we have always seen that it has done in the past. Mr. Foley, in his evidence, accepted that business travel will bounce back after recessions. That was a point that Mr. Foley made himself. I mean, I would also, we're not, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before, is that we're not suggesting that Bristol Airport is about to change massively in character. We're not. We're saying that it's going to get back to pretty much where it was in 2019 at around 14% business travel. And in our view, that is actually perfectly reasonable. I mean, particularly given the fact that we've already seen it at a higher level in 2015. And one of the reasons it was potentially maybe lower than it ought to have been in 2019 was the demise of BMI. But again, we've discussed that in quite some detail before. So, in my view, it is intuitively sensible to assume that we get back to around 14%. That we have a strong evidence base coming out of our econometric model that ultimately growth will return. Growth will business travel generally will be driven by economic growth, just as it always has been.
And then the argument about the growth in business passengers with Mr. Foley moved on to his table. I've just checked it. It is INQ 13, the table that had the yellow shaded areas. And we know that Mr. Ciro too relied on that explicitly in his evidence.
Yes.
And Mr. Foley started by looking at a 2000 to 2019 trend, which is how he justified saying that business travel would grow at half the rate of leisure travel. I think business was 4.1%, leisure was 8.1%. And Mr. Ciro similarly adopted that. Mr. Foley, after you'd put in your rebuttal, then produced INQ 18 and looked at then some shorter term trends. Mr. Ciro didn't explicitly revise his evidence in relation to that, but again, to what extent, to the extent that Mr. Ciro relies on those past trends, to what extent is that appropriate?
Well, I mean, I think as we've discussed in quite some detail and at quite some length, the table in question, I mean, I think ultimately Mr. Foley's original interpretation was simply wrong. I do not think the trend analysis was appropriate, and indeed, as he did in cross-examination, he abandoned his position in terms of the trend between 2002 and 2019. What that means is that Mr. Ciro's optimistic case, as he terms it, is, in my view, fundamentally flawed. There is no evidence there to suggest that, on the evidence that we have from more recent times, that leisure travel will grow twice as fast as business. There is no basis on which to essentially halve the presence of business traffic at Bristol Airport. We believe that our position is ultimately more sensible. It's backed up by the analysis that we've done in terms of the econometric model. It's backed up by those long-term growth rates, and it's actually backed up by the trends that we can see looking backwards in terms of the differential between business and leisure travel.
Then, still with business travel, slightly different point, and this is the point around attitudinal change, developments in the use of technology during the pandemic, particularly during lockdowns, and whether this represents a paradigm shift in the relationship between connectivity and business productivity.
Yes. Well, I think Mr. Ciro, I suppose, takes a very similar line ultimately to that which Mr. Foley took. That there has been a massive uptake in video conferencing over the last 15, 18 months, and that this will persist into the future. He cites a YouGov poll, which was undertaken, I think it was in December last year and January this year. In terms of the YouGov poll, I think I'd make a couple of particular comments. I mean, obviously, it was undertaken at the absolute height of the pandemic. We were just either heading towards second lockdown or going into second lockdown, spiralling cases. I don't think it is really appropriate to make a judgment about business behaviours in the best part of 10 years' time on the basis of an analysis taken at that point. I simply don't. I'd also point out it's a stated preference survey. We're asking some people what they think now. It's not real evidence of what they're going to do. It doesn't actually show that they're going to travel. It's simply a view of what they think at that moment in time. It's the same problem there is with sort of anything around attitudinal evidence. It isn't real evidence. It is about people's opinions of what they might do in a given circumstance. Also, I'd say the survey doesn't actually comment on overall business travel. It covers on the behaviour of individuals, which is back to the point I've made previously about individuals potentially flying less, but with economic growth fueling demand. They may fly less, others will be flying themselves as more people enter international markets, and the economy drives the need for international travel. Finally, it's much important that the question that's being looked at, the respondents state, they expect business travel to recover. It has been asked about the extent to which they recover. They do actually expect it to recover. In terms of sort of video conferencing, I mean, I think, again, I've made my decision sort of quite clear previously. Yes, of course, there has been an uptake in video conferencing over the last year. That people had no option. They've had to adapt. It doesn't mean it's people's preferred option. It doesn't mean that once travel restrictions are gone, people will not start travelling again. I think they will ultimately. I mean, I think the point was made that this inquiry could have been held entirely virtually. It wasn't, because people preferred to be in the same room. I was down last week because I wanted to be in the same room as everyone else, because that is by far my preference. So I think we've got to be very careful about this business of saying, well, we're all just going to do things online from now on. I don't think it's really true. I think there is obviously a long-term trend towards the greater use of technology. Again, we've discussed this. We've said that video conferencing will increase in the future. It almost certainly will. But has the pandemic produced a paradigm shift? No, I don't believe that it has. I think it's accelerated a trend that is already happening. And by the end of it, by 10 years' time, which is the point that we're actually looking at, we will be back onto that trend.
And I suppose a related point, can all business in any event be conducted remotely?
No.
You know, we looked, I think, at a survey last week. In fact, I think it was the 2011 City of London one, which you had done with Oxford Economics, that talked about post financial crisis, people cutting out unnecessary trips, but that some trips it is important to see clients face to face and so on. So what's your anticipation in terms of the need for people to actually go and speak to clients, visit sites, look at things?
I mean, my anticipation is that we will go through a similar process that we went through after the great financial crisis. Yes, people will be looking at their travel budgets for them. They will do, no doubt about it. We will look at what is necessary and what is important. And I think we will come to the view that many meetings, client meetings particularly, are likely to still be necessary. I mean, I think both Mr. Ciro and Mr. Foley mentioned their own experiences over recent months in terms of working in the I think it was the Middle East and Asia primarily, if I remember rightly. I mean, I said their experiences. I would highlight that ours have been quite different in many ways. We've had projects recently in Cyprus and in Brazil, for which we've been required to travel. It just wasn't acceptable not to travel. So I think there are two sides to every story on that one. Just sort of in terms of business travel more generally, you can't do everything virtually. Engineers cannot fix things virtually, generally speaking. You can't go on a site visit and inspect something properly virtually. It just doesn't work. You can't provide sort of elements of after sales care. You just can't do it. And as I think was pointed out actually in relation to the 2011 Aviation Services, there is a competitive element to this. If one company will go and visit a client and one company won't, there is a competitive advantage to those that visit, simply because ultimately humans prefer interacting face to face. Just sort of very quickly also on the 2011 aviation study, which was put to me by Mr. Taylor. I suppose it's also an important point here. That is a study about a very, very particular part of the UK economy, because I think he highlighted that I think 80 odd percent of travel was meetings. Very true. But that's not, that study was about the financial and business services sector in the City of London and the surrounding area, a very, very particular part of the UK economy. It is not necessarily representative, or indeed representative, of the rest of the UK economy. I mean, that really should be borne in mind.
I just want to move you right on then to you know, how you have looked at these things, how you've produced your figures for business productivity growth and the robustness or otherwise of those.
Certainly. I mean, I think what we have done is taken a baseline in which we've examined business travel patterns from across the southwest, regardless of which airport a business traveller is using. We've looked at isolating how many of those business travellers are purely dependent on Bristol Airport by doing a generalised cost analysis. So we've looked at their cost for travelling via Bristol Airport, we've looked at their cost for travelling via another airport. That's given us a view on those that are purely reliant on Bristol, and that gives us the ability to use the Oxford Economics relationship to identify a baseline business productivity effect, which is based around the connectivity of the whole area, not just the individual passenger, as it were. And we've then projected forward based on the peer proposal forecast that we have discussed. It was a detailed forecasting exercise. It uses the DFT elasticities to understand growth at the airport. They've used a very long time series, as we've discussed in some depth, during which we've had many recessions, many booms. We've had pandemics. We've had major changes in society, we've changes in technology. We've had all of these things that we've discussed before. Those are built into the elasticities that we have used in terms of future growth of business travel. That study has been extensively peer reviewed, and I remain of the view that the DFT's work is probably the best evidence base in terms of future elasticities that we have. And we have, importantly, we have no evidence that they are not still valid, ultimately. Indeed, we know that from the direct zero consultation that they are still being used by DFT. They have included an uncertainty band, yes, they have, but equally, they are still using to consider future growth, and that they are therefore still using those elasticities that we are using.
There was another line of challenge to growth in business productivity, which was along the lines of you, Mr. Brass, have not identified all the business destinations that are going to emerge over the next 9-10 years. And obviously I discussed the econometric modelling with Mr. Foley, but to what extent is that a valid line of challenge?
Ultimately, it's not. We are talking about something 10 years out. We cannot sensibly, with an econometric model, identify individual business destinations that might come forward in 10 years' time. Mr. Foley accepted this point. Mr. Serra accepted this point. We are talking about 2030. Yes, we have evidence that things are coming back. And already we've got Lufthansa restarted, I believe, yesterday. We've seen that in the past, Bristol has always added city destinations as part of its route portfolio. And indeed, Mr. Siro has kindly pointed out in his table, figure 4.1 on page 24 of his proof, that there are lots of existing business destinations already served from Bristol Airport. Not all business travel needs to be about new destinations. Hubs, particularly, obviously provide a broad range of options for business travellers, and there are plenty of existing major business centres served from Bristol Airport, which would accommodate future demand.
I want to just move on slightly. You touched on before that the Oxford Economic Business Connectivity GDP figures are accepted or implicit in Mr. Ciro's optimistic case and his agreement if our business travels right in business productivity on our case, but that relationship was not accepted by Dr. Chapman.
No.
And he suggested that the relationship should be much lower. Again, get you to comment on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Chapman, as you say, takes the view that the elasticity relationship should be a lot lower, a lot smaller. I think it's an important point to say that he doesn't say it should be zero, so he would expect some growth, so he's not saying that it's zero. But ultimately, my view is he is out of step with the evidence that we have. I mean, if we take a look at my rebuttal proof, where I've covered this at on page 17 and 18, sorry, bullet point 3 on 17 down to 18, I think it is. And sorry, it goes over the page, that's right.
So is that in your, did you say forecasting proof?
Rebuttal proof on socioeconomics.
Sorry.
Sorry, my apologies. Dr. Chapman, sorry, I'll wait till the people get there. Dr. Chapman sort of cited a study which was undertaken by Oxford Economics, which then cites a study which was undertaken, an early study undertaken by Intervistus, which identified an elasticity of 0.007 as opposed to the 0.05 that has been identified by Oxford Economics in their work. I mean, I think it's fair to say that 0.007 is quite old now. It's based on a number of different economies. It's not a UK specific relationship, and it is genuinely out of step with what's been identified elsewhere. I mean, more recent work by Intervistus themselves has actually come up with a relationship to connectivity of 0.05, so basically the same level as Oxford Economics, which you can find in CD 1111 on page 51, should you wish to. Oxford Economics, again for Eurocontrol, identified an elasticity of around 0.06, so again very similar to the one that we're using, in fact slightly higher. And PwC for the Airports Commission has identified an elasticity between seat capacity and economic growth of around 0.1, so actually considerably higher than our assessment. And again, that can be seen in CD 11.22 on page 27. And I would also say that more recent work again by Oxford Economics, they're still using the 0.05 extensively within their work. So ultimately, Dr. Chapman, I think, has found a particular study that has a much lower elasticity. But I think more recent evidence, and the majority of evidence, is that the elasticity is nearer to 0.05, and we believe that is a robust and sensible position.
And we can see, as I think you were pointing out in your paragraph 2.3.4 in your rebuttal proof on socioeconomics, bottom of page 17, top of page 18, to the extent that they need to, the inspectors can see all the CD references and page references to that more recent data.
That's correct, yes.
I think we've talked about Mr. Ciro's balanced view and optimistic view. So I think I'm then going to just bring you on to the topic of displacement. And you said earlier when we were touching on the areas of agreement that this is a difficult area. Are there recognized methodologies for calculating displacement?
There are methodologies for doing it, but there are many of them. There is no set view. It is a difficult area. Anything around displacement always involves considerable uncertainty. The gross effects of any development are a lot more certain than the net, I think it's fair to say. I think it's also important to try and understand why we look at displacement and why it's given so much time in things like the Green Book and WebTag. I mean, it's primarily a matter for public sector interventions. And obviously what we're discussing here isn't a public sector intervention, it's a private sector investment. Government interventions are about addressing market failure or addressing inequities in the market. They're about trying to improve the way that a market functions. Because the price signals and the market signals that are coming out from that market are not reflecting society effectively. Therefore, within guidance around public sector interventions, there's a need to avoid doing accidental harm, essentially, by distorting the market in inappropriate ways. I mean, there's a need to avoid what's sometimes called crowding out, trying to make sure that the government's involvement in the market doesn't affect the behaviour of private entities, which inappropriately against market forces, or it doesn't result in them reducing behaviour or doing things that they wouldn't have done otherwise, which are appropriate. This is why, in a lot of public sector guidance, there is such a focus on displacement. It is a very important issue from a public sector intervention point of view. It is. There's no way around that. Although, in having said that, I mean, it is actually worth noting that the latest version of Green Book, which does take a slightly different view, particularly in terms of what they're called place-based assessment, which is examining the impacts within particular areas and regions. They have started to move away from the sort of idea of 100% displacement. I mean, CD 11.55 on page 93, we could have a quick look at.
Sorry, that's CD
1155 on page 93. And paragraphs, sorry, excuse me. Where are we? A2.6 to A2.8, an explanation of when and how.
Just pause for a moment. Let us get there, because I think the PDF page is slightly different. So real page 93. I think that's
sorry,
101.
Yes.
Have I got that right?
Yes.
So which paragraph are you taking us to?
I think I'm taking you to primarily A2.7, actually. There are some differences in the approach permitted for place-based appraisal, where the primary objective is to analyse the impact on the place or places in question. The effects on the relevant travel to workers should also be included if they are liable to be affected. Box 26 summarises the differences. Large effects of strategic nature should be taken into account with the programme of which the project under consideration is a part. Project decisions should take place in the overall context. Sorry. I do apologise. I think I may have. My apologies. I think my highlighting has gone funny in my. Sorry, I do apologise.
The next paragraph deals with if a proposal has geographically targeted.
Sorry, that's the area I was getting at. I do
objectives.
apologise. Yeah. In addition to the effects considered for a UK level appraisal, place-based appraisal may also include employment changes in the area under consideration. So in other words, it's saying that you no longer have to automatically assume 100% displacement. I do apologise, my highlighting has gone completely strange there. So it's saying that this the original 100% displacement assumption has been removed. I think what we're obviously dealing with here is a private sector investment. We're not looking at the same thing. We're not looking at a public sector intervention. We're looking at something that is responding to market signals in its own right. So the same concerns about crowding out aren't there. What comes forward in terms of private sector investment is subject to market forces that should result in a market efficient and optimal outcome. And in this context, displacement is of limited relevance, ultimately. I mean, I would also say the ultimate displacement is a theoretical construct. We can't actually observe it. We can never actually see the counterfactual because it never happens. So again, that puts uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty into the process. There is finally, I just want to a sort of conceptual point again, particularly around sort of factor displacement, is there's a danger of simply assuming away the benefits of a private sector investment. Essentially what we're saying, if I said we're applying a 100% factor displacement, is that somebody else will provide the good or service, or the person who would have provided it will do something else. Some other job will come forward, some other investment will be made, and they will go and do that instead. And I think fundamentally that's just not really a safe assumption. I mean, it assumes there's no unemployment for a start. I mean, it assumes that there's no effect in terms of helping unemployed people back into work and addressing deprivation in that way. It assumes that there's no labour migration. I mean, it assumes that if these jobs aren't created at the airport, that people still stay in the area. We just don't know that. Similarly, if the airport does go ahead, it assumes that no one comes from outside of the area to work at the airport. It assumes that the airport has no impact on FDI, on the connectivity, foreign direct investment, and the connectivity that it offers. It's saying that there's no investment from overseas as a result of the airport. And as I said earlier, it fundamentally assumes that other private sector investors come forward. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, just taking the area we're looking at, as we've said, we've got population growth expected at 8 or 9% by 2030. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to need jobs at the end of the day, and there's going to be a large labour supply that need jobs by then. What Bristol Airport's proposal is supposed to support in terms of new jobs is only a small fraction of what will be required to actually keep that population employed at current levels of employment. We don't know what else is going to come forward. There are obviously other proposals. We don't know if there's sufficient on the table to even get anywhere close to what is required. We simply don't know. We cannot sensibly move forward and just ignore the potential benefits that come forward with the airport and assume away by assuming that something else will happen.
Just kind of move you on to a slightly different but related point. There seemed to be a suggestion at various points that Bristol's traffic should be deliberately constrained down to 10 million, so that passengers that would want to fly from Bristol in the 12 million case just weren't able to, and that actually this could be good for other airports in South Wales, Cardiff, or other airports in the southwest. Just just explain that concept, the idea of deliberately constraining an airport in order to try to push passengers and economic growth to other places.
Ultimately, I would view that as fundamentally anti-competitive, and it would not likely result in the optimal economic outcome for everyone ultimately, because you're not letting the market compete as it should. Increasing capacity at Bristol Airport to 12 million does not stop the other airports from growing. Ultimately, our view is that they will still grow. Yes, some traffic might be diverted to them if Bristol were to be constrained, but they will still grow one way or the other. Bristol, from what we can see, is the preferred choice for people to fly within the market. They want to travel via Bristol. And as far as I'm aware, there's no policy that demand should be directed to some other airport simply to sort of support economic growth elsewhere. I mean, it comes back to this sort of levelling up, levelling down point. We're not trying to level down, we're trying to level up. If other places need greater support, fine. But that is not an argument to constrain Bristol Airport at the end of the day. If Bristol is constrained, our estimate is that around 28% of passengers would travel to another airport in the southwest and South Wales. That is forcing them to fly from somewhere that is suboptimal for them. It's making them travel further. It's making it go to an airport which might cost more. It may even be making them switch to a destination they don't particularly want to travel to. In our view, that means you're shifting not only the passenger, but you're also shifting the connectivity that comes with it. But you're moving the economic centres in the southwest and South Wales. Those benefits that you get from connectivity around business productivity and tourism will start to shift as well. But ultimately, you're also going to lose things. It's going to become more fragmented. They are going to, yes, you will gain back some of the connectivity benefits and business productivity benefits around Cardiff, but you're not going to get them back to the same extent you would have done if you'd had it at Bristol.
And you've already touched on the point, I suppose,
yes,
about population growth in the southwest, but just looking at the figures that for jobs that have now been agreed between yourself and Mr. Ciro, to what extent are these, if growth is allowed at Bristol Airport, to what extent are these real jobs for people?
Well, as I've already said, the certainty around gross jobs, i.e. those that are created by the appeal proposal, is higher than it is around net jobs. These are, those jobs, particularly direct jobs, are real jobs on site at the airport that we've agreed. They are potentially there, able to help address areas of deprivation around the airport in Weston-super-Mare and in South Bristol. There is a package of measures in place through the Skills and Employment Plan to help people access those jobs. And there's ongoing discussions about transport measures to try and improve accessibility and extend accessibility to the airport to enable people to get to these jobs. We've also seen that they're relatively well paid jobs. I accept the data around the levels of pay at the airport is difficult. I understand that. I don't deny that. But from what we can see, they are relatively well paid, well and secure jobs. They are good quality jobs for real people that can help address deprivation, at the very real deprivation in the areas around the airport.
And again, you won't have the very latest table, but I cross-examined Mr. Ciro at the end of last week on his table 6.3, his displacement figures, and if we're talking about those real jobs in North Somerset, his table shows that if the airport was not allowed to grow to 12 million, some 12% of those jobs and GVA would go to Cardiff Airport, nothing else in the southwest and South Wales, which is about 12% in the study area, but some 88%, sorry, would go to airports and localities outside the study area, being Heathrow, Gatwick, Birmingham, and Luton. And again, to what extent would that form of constraint, forcing people and jobs to other places, be consistent with levelling up?
It wouldn't. It wouldn't. I mean, I know Mr. Ciro has made the point that there are more deprived areas I'm using deprived in a broad sense here, in Cardiff, particularly Cardiff was mentioned a number of times, than there are in the west of England. But I would point again to the point that we're talking about levelling up. Yes, the areas in Cardiff need support. Absolutely, that's fine. Don't have a problem with that at all. But that is not an argument to constrain other parts of the UK, including the west of England. It is about levelling up, not levelling down.
And when I asked Dr. Chapman about this, he made a point that if Bristol Airport is allowed to grow, that would actually be taking jobs from those other airports, not jobs that would be newly created if they were to expand, but in some way taking existing jobs from those other airports. What do you have to say about that?
I have no reason to believe that's true. I mean, ultimately, we still expect the other airports in the southwest and South Wales to still grow. There is therefore no reason why existing jobs at those airports would be affected.
And obviously, that with Mr. Ciro, we're looking there at the passengers that are displaced. Of those that do not fly, is there any reason to believe that spending in either North Somerset or west of England or southwest and south of Wales will create the equivalent number of jobs or any jobs in other fields other than aviation?
Well, the simple answer is we don't know. We don't know what people are going to spend their money on or where they're going to spend it. Mr. Ciro's assumption seems to be that they will simply, if they don't fly, they'll simply spend it in their local area. That may be true, but equally, you could argue that the most likely thing, if you cannot fly to go on your holidays, that you will go somewhere else in the UK. You will simply drive there, or take the train, or whatever it might be. Equally, you might buy an import. You might simply save the money. It may have been a discretionary spend. We might fancy doing something, and you may just save the money to do something else. You simply can't safely assume that it's simply spent in the immediate area. And the other point, again, is back to this point about population growth, is that we're going to need, new jobs are going to need to be created. Is it simply saying that they will spend money in the local economy and it will just produce another job? Somebody still has to invest to do that. Somebody has to create these jobs. And looking 10 years out, where we've got getting on for 10% population growth and that significant number of new jobs needed, that's simply not a safe assumption in my view.
Well, I mean, if there was an economic concept that people will just simply spend their money on something else and the equivalent jobs will be created in the local area, I mean, would we ever have areas of deprivation in the country?
No, you'd have no areas of deprivation. They'd all be doing something. Somebody would have spent some money somewhere to do something, so they would have a job. So no, you wouldn't get areas of deprivation. You wouldn't have unemployment.
So what does it tell you about that concept that something will turn up?
It's a false concept. It's just assuming a wage benefit.
Mr. Chapman made various points on this. His point seemed to be that if growth was displaced to other airports, it was possible that more jobs would be created at those other airports because of the employment profile or efficiency of those airports. Again, if you can just very briefly set out your position on that.
Certainly, yes. I mean, I think it's difficult to describe how fundamentally I disagree with that point. Dr. Chapman is essentially saying that if you move a passenger from Bristol to another airport, the rate at which that other airport will create jobs is the same as its current employment density. That is not sensible, ultimately. If you look at some of the alternate airports we have here, I'm just going to take three by way of example. Heathrow. Heathrow has, I think from memory from Dr. Chapman's evidence, an employment density somewhere around over 900 jobs per million passengers per annum, nearly double that of Bristol. But you do need to look at why that is the case. Heathrow is a global hub airport with multiple runways, multiple terminals, significant long-haul traffic, a huge range of ancillary services. That density has nothing to do with flying a short-haul passenger. The vast majority of those things are going to inflate its employment density. You do not need all of those things, and you will not change all of those things by adding one more short-haul passenger. You're just not going to. You cannot make that assumption. It is not sensible. Exeter is another one at the opposite end of the scale. It's a small airport. It has substantially underutilised capacity. It will naturally have a higher employment density. It also, until their sad demise, had the Flybe head office. The presence of an airline head office will substantially increase the employment density at an airport like Exeter. Will the head office increase if one more passenger arrives from Bristol? No, it will not. You do not need all those people to fly that passenger. Cardiff. Cardiff has a significant British Airways maintenance base out there at the airport. Again, this will substantially raise the employment density of the airport. Will an additional passenger transferring from Bristol to Cardiff affect activity at that maintenance base? No, it will not. You cannot simply assume the shift is to the employment density at the other airport. The only thing you can sensibly assume is that the productivity level at which the service is delivered is similar to that of Bristol. The other point being that if it was not, you may well end up with such a fundamental change in price that the displacement may never happen in the first place. So you simply cannot do what Dr. Chapman has done. It does not make sense.
Moving on now to the next topic, just outbound.
Mr. Humphreys, I just wonder whether we might just have a quick break at this point.
Yes, sir.
Is it a logical place to stop?
It is. It's a natural break. I was just going to deal with three other points, but they'll take more than 5 or 10 minutes. So outbound tourism, just web tag, and then cost benefit analysis. They're all smaller, obviously, than the topics we've already covered. So perfectly logical place to stop.
All right. Okay. Shall we come back at 11 then?
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Right, it's 20 past 11 or thereabouts. Are we ready to continue, Mr. Humphreys?
Yes, sir. Mr. Brass, three topics to cover. First of them, outbound tourism. Is this issue about balance of payments and outbound tourism, is this, frankly, a new argument in airport inquiries?
No, it's not, ultimately. It's been an argument at airport inquiries raised by objectors for as long as I can remember, which, well, sadly, I'm showing my age. I think I started doing economic impact analysis of airports in 1998. So it's been around a long time, and as far as I know, it has not been accepted anywhere.
And I covered with witnesses last week what DFT has said about these things. So again, just characterize what Mr. Serro said firstly, and your position in relation to that.
Certainly, I think Mr. Serro's included outbound tourism within his section on uncertainty. I think he makes a number of points, and it's probably worth just touching on one or two of those to start off with. If we have his proof to hand, para 8.3.3, sorry, on page 51. He does. I mean, he does recognise that this is a complex area. In the very first sentence there, and he then moves on to talk about the Green Book and what is relevant and why it should be included. And I suppose a couple of points is yes, it is a complex area. The reason it is complex is because it's a two-way problem. You've not just got people spending money overseas. You've got what happens in the UK, you've got what the alternatives are, and you've also got what, very importantly, what the long-run effect of not being able to go on holiday from a nearby airport would do to a place as a place to live and work. So there's a long-run effect on GDP from the attractiveness of a city as a place to live. It is complex. So I think trying to simply do a little accounting exercise that says there are this many people going overseas, they spend this much money equals this much, is frankly not helpful. It doesn't get at the heart of the problem. You cannot look at one side without looking at the other. It's not the same issue with inbound tourism. Inbound tourism is an injection into the economy. In our study area, you don't have the same issue. I'd also say that in terms of sort of being necessary for Green Book, there's a couple of points. Again, one, as we've already discussed quite late, the Green Book is not a relevant standard. It's about public sector interventions. I'd also say that, as is highlighted by Mr. Serro in paragraph 8.3.3, and sort of towards the end of that paragraph, that the Green Book is based on the principles and ideas of welfare economics and concerns overall social welfare efficiency. An impact on, the expenditure that goes overseas from the UK, from outbound tourism, is not an effect on welfare. It's a GDP effect, potentially, assuming you allow any of the other things, assuming you ignore everything else, which, as I say, I wouldn't accept. So it is simply not appropriate to try and put a number on it. It just doesn't really work. And I think, as I said, it just gives you a badly skewed result. All you've got is the negative. You haven't got any of the positives at all. So what we've done is dealt with it qualitatively, and we think that is the appropriate way to do so. And that is the way that is ultimately backed up by the UK government's policy. The UK government has said that there is no evidence to suggest that decreasing outbound tourism from the UK would increase prosperity in the UK. There's no evidence to suggest that. Therefore, in terms of the sort of calculation that Mr. Serra has made, I have no problem with his maths. That's absolutely fine. I just don't accept the premise of the calculation. I'd also then make just a couple of other points. So he contends that, he accepts that there are welfare benefits from overseas travel in terms of quality of life and skills and learning experiences. But he says there's sort of no evidence to suggest that going overseas has a particularly greater influence, as it were. I mean, first point is he presents no evidence of this at all. And secondly, I mean, you would have to say intuitively, overseas travel must have a greater benefit in terms of quality of life and experience and learning and skills development. It is a chance to experience different cultures, to do different things, speak different languages. There are any number of reasons why it would have a greater impact. And finally, just in relation to the council's position, I think it does seem to have changed markedly from the original planning application. I mean, if we look at CD 411, which is the officer's report, on page 31, it says, I'm looking at the second paragraph there. The APF, Aviation Policy Framework, considers the economic impact of outbound tourism in para 1.16. It says, referring to consultation responses on the subject, that some respondents considered there was a tourism deficit as more UK residents travelled abroad than overseas residents to travel to the UK. Other respondents highlighted that outbound tourism supports UK-based jobs in the travel and airline industry and boosts high street consumer demand before trips are made. It goes on to say that the evidence available to us does not show that a decrease in the number of UK residents flying abroad for their holidays would have an overall benefit for the UK economy. That is the point I was just making about the DfT's position. BAL recognises that there are several opportunities to optimise the amount of economic impact, including that from inbound tourism. However, as this is not a negative impact on the expansions, officers consider the appropriate form to achieve this is through a strengthened strategic relationship between local authorities, destination management organisations and BAL. This group will be tasked with realising as much positive impact from inbound tourism as possible. Officers are comfortable that it will take place outside the planning process. The point I think that's being made here is that officers accepted DfT's position that outbound tourism does not have a negative effect on the UK economy. What they are interested in is enhancing inbound tourism, which is precisely what will come with the appeal proposal.
Dr. Chapman, we know, made various similar points in his evidence, and in your rebuttal, you draw attention to the fact that he made similar points in relation to the application to expand Leeds Bradford Airport, and in your paragraph 5.3.1, you draw attention to comments in the Volterra report in response to him there. Can we just look at that? Yeah. So it's CD 11.16, and within that PDF page 18, I think it's actual page 17, and you've drawn attention in your evidence to paragraph 3.32 in the Volterra report, and I'm not going to get you to read out that paragraph, but there are a number of bullet points there made by Volterra in response to precisely this point, and perhaps just get you to kind of again summarize another consultancy, very well-known consultancy, their response on this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, Volterra is a well-known consultancy. They were independent to this process. They were employed by the City Council, and they were asked to look at this issue. And as you can see there, they viewed this simple treatment of outbound tourism as a pure negative, as just simplistic and flawed essentially. I mean, I think there's a number of points they make there. They talk about the amount being spent within the UK before people go, which is one point. But I think sort of the one I draw attention to particularly is the point made in bullet point 3. And sort of the methodology does not consider two other important factors. It does not quantify the positive welfare impacts of outbound tourism on LCR, which is Leeds City Region residents, although it does acknowledge that these positive welfare benefits, such as freedom of choice and freedom of movement, would occur. And 2, and I think this is the one that I think is particularly important, really, is the methodology does not quantify the potential positive impact on the Leeds City Region economy that would occur through the application being more accessible. It is likely that the area would become a less attractive and hence less economically prosperous place to live if travel options were restricted out of the Leeds City Region, as less UK residents would want to live in the area. I mean, this is just the point I was making just now, that if you do not have an attractive place to live, which offers people the opportunity to go on holiday from a relatively local airport, then it becomes a fundamentally less attractive place to live. You cannot attract talent, you cannot get people to come and live there, and that will fundamentally reduce GDP over the long term. We cannot, within the evidence base that we have, estimate that effect. But in my view, it is potentially significant, and along with all the other potential offsetting effects that I've discussed in my proof, then I think the only safe assumption must be that the overall balanced effect of outbound tourism is relatively limited. Any effect is relatively limited, or possibly even positive.
Now, Mr. Brass, I'm going to again move you on. We've got 2 points to cover. I've got 14 minutes unless I go over my time estimate, so we're both under pressure. Compliance with web tag, and quite a lot of has been said about this, but can we just look at web tags? So we need CD 11.8. And we've looked at PDF page 3, section 1.1, and the material about government interventions. I just want to ask you about one aspect of that. In paragraph 1.1.3, it says this unit is expected to apply to the appraisal of most government interventions in the aviation industry, including individual policies, broader strategies, many regulations, and the approach to planning applications for individual schemes. The approach to planning applications for individual schemes.
Yeah.
Now, insofar as government has intervened by setting out policy in relation to aviation, what has government said about the use of WebTag?
It hasn't said anything very much at all. It is not. It is not considered. It's not recommended for economic assessment in relation to private sector activities. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the only place WebTag might be thought to be mentioned in this context is in relation to the ANPS, which is CD 6.9, if you wish to look at, and it's at para 5.10.
So just wait for a moment. Let's just have a look.
Sorry,
and see what
people
government...
actually want to go there. Yes, I'll hang on a moment. I will go there as well.
Okay, if this takes me over my 14 minutes, I'll just have to take the consequences. So, sorry, what paragraph?
CD 6.9, para 510.
.10.
This is the only reference I can find. The applicant should assess the implications of airport expansion on surface access network capacity using the WebTag methodology stipulated in the Department for Transport guidance or any successor to such methodology. It does not relate to economic assessment.
Thank you. Socioeconomic CBA, you have included a high level of socioeconomic cost-benefit
Yes.
analysis in the economic impact assessment addendum. You tell us, I'm sure no one will mind me leading you on this, in paragraph 4.3 that it's not a WebTag assessment. What is it, and what does it show, and what are the criticisms of it, and what do you say about them?
I mean, I think it's quite important that ultimately what the primary analysis within the economic impact assessment addendum is around the GBA and employment assessment, and that is what is the basis for assessment of the significance of the appeal proposal. The socio-economic cost-benefit analysis is a high-level additional piece of analysis supposed to provide some additional evidence on the costs and benefits to various users in the economy. It is not a WebTag assessment. It was never intended to be a WebTag assessment. It is supporting evidence. It's just taking a different view on the appeal proposal. What it demonstrates is that net of carbon costs, the appeal proposal over the next 60 years would support around 820 million up to 863 million of value. It does not cover every single cost and benefit. No, it doesn't. It doesn't include some costs. It doesn't also include some benefits. Mr. Ciro has noted that NBV has fallen since the original application. It's quite right, it has. That mainly relates to, obviously, the inclusion of carbon costs, which is something that was mentioned by North Somerset Council in relation to the planning application. That is the primary reason for the change. The other reason, which is still not one of the other reasons, is the automatic effect of increased discounting. As we have moved the year at which Bristol Airport reaches 12 million back 4 years, but we're still working from a 2018 baseline, the effect of discounting within the process will automatically reduce benefits there further into the future. In my view, it's what it was intended to be. It's a proportionate assessment of some different costs and benefits from a socio-economic welfare perspective. I know that Mr. Ciro doesn't, as far as I can see, criticise the other elements of it. He makes note that there is no assessment of air quality and noise. No, there isn't, but they're not judged to be significant effects within the environmental impact assessment, so it would not be proportional to include them. I mean, I note also Dr. Chapman's comments, which I think largely relate ultimately to web tag and trying to see it through the prism of web tag, which is ultimately not what it was intended to do.
Mr. Brass, unless there's anything else you need to add, I think that is your evidence in chief.
I don't think so, Mr. Humphries. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Right. Mr. Taylor, are you there? Not quite.
I am, sir.
Do you want to crack on now, and then we'll look for a suitable place to stop? Assume you're not going to wrap it up in an hour and 20 minutes.
I don't know is the answer. I'll try. It depends very much on Mr. Brass, but I'll stop at an appropriate moment and see where we get to. All right, thank you. Mr. Brass, we're back to the old new way of doing it, as it were.
Indeed.
I want to start, please, by taking you to the airport's policy framework, which is CD 6.1. So I should say I haven't produced a list of the CD documents, I'm afraid. I know that I get a slap wrist for that, but I just haven't had the opportunity. There are very few documents on my list. I think there's only 2 that we haven't already looked at this morning, so you should have them to hand. So APF is CD 6.1.
I have it.
Thank you. And in that document, I've just got to find it myself now. I've got so many open. Here it is. I wanted to take you to paragraph 5, please, which is on page 9.
9, just a moment.
This is under the heading, the benefits of aviation. It says the government's primary objective is to achieve long-term economic growth. Then it says this: the aviation sector is a major contributor to the economy, and we support its growth within a framework which maintains a balance between the benefits of aviation and its costs, particularly its contribution to climate change and noise.
Yes.
So we see there that the approach is one of maintaining a balance between benefits and costs, don't we?
We do.
Yeah. And indeed, that approach of looking at benefits and costs is reflected in the core strategy as well. We haven't looked, I don't think, yet at that. Given that we're in a plan-led context, that's rather amusing. But if we look at CD 5.06, that's the core strategy. I want to take you to page 97 of the PDF.
Sorry, so 5.06,
Mr. Brass.
Sorry, it's 5.6 to me, I do apologise. Yeah. So, page number?
It's page 97 of the PDF, and hopefully you'll see CS23.
I can indeed, yes.
And we see there that the proposals for the development of Bristol Airport will be required to demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface infrastructure. Again, in essence, what is required is to look at a balance between benefit and cost. Yes?
That is correct, yes.
All right, thank you. So, when we're looking at the policy framework generally, there's a balance to be struck. Yes?
There it is.
And in order to strike that balance, one side we need to understand the benefits that a proposal would deliver and give weight to those benefits, yes?
That is correct.
And the greater those benefits are, the greater the weight one would give them.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. And the other side, of course, is that we need to understand the costs, yes?
We do, yes.
And the greater the costs are, the greater the weight we give to those, yes?
Within the, well,
right.
we are getting outside of my area. I'm looking at
Okay,
socioeconomics.
fine.
Planning balance
But-
is not within my area of competence.
That's excellent. Well,
But in broad terms, yes.
the socio-economic appraisal process feeds into the judgment around that balance, doesn't
Yes,
it?
no, it does, yes.
And if we look, you took us to the Green Book earlier, CD 1153,
Indeed.
and I wanted to go to a different part of that, to PDF page 13.
One moment.
It's
So it's 1153.
It's CD 1153, PDF page 13, and this is the introduction to appraisal and evaluation, and it gives a non-technical introduction to appraisal and evaluation, which is why I read it.
Sorry, just a moment, Mr. Taylor. What I've got coming up at 1153 is a 4-page something.
I think what you've got are the links through to the document itself. So if you click on the Green Book 2020 link, the PDF should open up.
Hang on. My apologies. Aha, right, sorry, yes. Page
PDF 13, 13.
13. Right, sorry, yes.
And this just ties into the discussion we were just having. Paragraph 2.2, appraisal is the process of assessing the costs, benefits and risks of alternative ways to meet government objectives. It helps decision makers to understand the potential effects, trade-offs and overall impact of options by providing an objective evidence base for decision making.
Yeah.
See that? So the process that we're engaged in terms of looking at the socio-economic impact assessment is just that. It's a process of assessing the costs and benefits, isn't it?
It's part of that process, yes.
Yeah. And to do that, we look at two scenarios. We look at the do something scenario, in other words, Bristol Airport with 12 million passengers per annum, and the do nothing scenario, Bristol Airport at 10 million passengers per annum. Yes?
Yes.
And the impact in terms of benefits and costs arises from the difference between those two scenarios, doesn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. All right. Now, just a few questions, if I may, about the nature of your assessment. Now, in terms of displacement, up until I think it was last week, the displacement calculations that you'd set out in your assessment were described as a sensitivity, but you've sent round an erratum, and it's no longer to be described in that way. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Taylor. I apologise for the mislabeling of the relevant table. In about 2 paragraphs up, it does make clear that the core assessment that we were undertaking is based on the net figures.
Right. So when we look at the assessment in CD 222, it's the tables which include displacement, which represent your assessment for the purposes of this inquiry. All right. Thank you.
That is correct.
Right. And I think it's right that that change last week is the first time that you have accepted that displacement should be included as part of your position since Jacobs began raising the issue in 2019. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't say that is correct.
No.
As I've just said, I mean, the mislabeled table within CD 2.22 was mislabeled. We have accepted that displacement should be a quantified core consideration throughout the appeal process.
Right. let's just unpack that slightly. The appraisal that officers had when they reported to the committee from you did not include displacement, did it?
No, it did not.
Right.
It was dealt with. Let me just finish the point. No, it did not have a quantitative adjustment for displacement. No, it did not.
Right. So the first time you calculated, for the purposes of your assessment, displacement was in the addendum economic assessment that was produced at the very end of November of 2020. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And we know that document as CD 222, don't we?
We do.
Okay. Thank you. Now, just so that I have got the position absolutely straight. Yeah, okay, that's fine, thank you. That's very helpful. Now, in terms then of how your position has changed since the assessment which officers had when they reported to committee and the position you now adopt, in terms of net present value, the assessment with displacement in CD 222, I think, is an NPV of 820 million. Is that right? Does that sound right?
I think we're talking slightly at cross purposes, Mr. Taylor.
Right.
The socio-economic cost-benefit analysis has always allowed for shifting and demand. It's essential to the calculation ultimately. Displacement that we're talking about here applies to the GVA and employment assessment.
Okay. I just want to look, please, at how your assessment has changed.
No, please carry on.
Okay. Just looking at I know there are a number of changes that you've made, and you've explained what those are in CD 222. Your current position in terms of net present value, as set out in CD 222, and we can go there if you want to, but I'm trying to short-circuit it.
No, we don't need to. I can remember the numbers, don't worry.
Okay. The MPV, as I understand it now, is 820 million.
It's between 820 and I think 863, if I remember, but yes.
Right. Against the previous assessment of MPV of 1,565 million, or 1.56 billion.
That's correct, yes.
Right, so that's almost a halving of MPV. Yeah?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in terms of the change since the initial assessment, CD 208, to what is now contained in CD 222,
yes.
Your GVA has reduced by 80 million, yeah?
Correct.
You've got 1,150 fewer jobs, 915 fewer FTE full-time equivalents, yeah?
Those figures sound familiar, yes.
I think we can see that in CD 222, page 31, table 313, if we really want to go there.
No, I'm sure. I'll just get to but I'm sure you are correct. It is in there, yes.
Okay. So those are reductions of over 20%, yeah?
Yes, they are reductions. They are, of course, on a different basis. That they are now have a quantitative assessment and displacement. But yes, they are a reduction of about 20%.
Yeah. So since officers reported to committee on Bristol Airport's own case, the economic benefits have significantly reduced. Would you accept that?
No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't accept they've significantly reduced. No,
Okay.
I would say that they have being reduced by the process of adding a quantitative assessment of displacement into it. But I would also point out that Jacobs had already done assessment of displacement to help inform officers, which had already reduced our economic benefits the previous time round. I would ultimately say that within that context, 20% is not a significant reduction.
What about almost a halving of NPV? That's not significant in your view.
It's again on a different basis. You're including carbon costs. You're pushing it the proposal out by 4 years. You're using more up-to-date data. You would expect some changes, but the vast majority of that is driven by the addition of carbon costs and the process of moving the proposal further into the future.
So you regard almost halving NPV as what, de minimis, Mr. Brass? Is that your position?
What I'm saying is that you have to, on a like-for-like basis, it is not halved.
Right. Okay. Right. Let's move on and consider economic context a little bit, please. Now, I think you've already made the point, and you'll hopefully agree this without too much difficulty, that North Somerset and the west of England catchment areas that you've looked at are already prosperous locations.
Well, I agree that in totality and on average, yes, they are.
Yeah.
There are, of course, as we've already established, pockets of deprivation.
Indeed. Let's just look at Mr. Ciro's proof, please, page 9.
I have it.
His 3.2.1.
Yeah.
He establishes that in terms of the west of England, GDP per capita is 7% higher than the UK average.
Mm-hmm.
And he also then goes on to look at the position if you strip out London and look at the performance of the west of England against the rest of the UK, then the GDP per capita in the west of England is 20% higher than the UK taking out London.
It does, yes.
Okay. He also goes on to look at its labour market in the next paragraph. Just want to see if you can agree this. He describes it as having a strongly performing labour market. Would you agree with that?
Based on the figures today, yes, I would agree that is a strong performance.
Thank you. He looks at the proportion of the working age population in employment or seeking work, and notes that at 85.1% it was markedly higher than for the South West and Great Britain. You accept that, don't you?
Yes.
And he also looks at employment growth between 2012 and 2019 and says that's far exceeded the national average, increasing by 15.4% compared to Great Britain's increase of 11.4% over the same period. You accept that? Yes. Too? And the West of England employment growth, he says, has also surpassed the national average, increased by 15.9% comparing to the 11.4%. Yes? All right, thank you. Now, Mr. Ciro also went on to look at a comparison of relative prosperity with the areas around other airports that are of interest at this inquiry. Here's page 18, please, table 3.2.
One moment. Yes.
Now, I don't understand you to challenge the figures in table 3.2, do you? You accept those numbers?
I can't see any reason to not accept them. They are
okay.
ONS numbers.
And from that, we can see that the GVA per head is greater in the West of England area, then the GVA per head around Bournemouth, Newquay, Exeter, Cardiff, can't we?
We can.
Yeah. So we can conclude that the West of England is more prosperous than the local areas around those 4 other regional airports, can't we?
We can conclude that on average, yes, we can. Again, averages are averages. There is pockets of deprivation, as we've already established, around Bristol Airport, and there are pockets of deprivation around all the others, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to come on to how we deal with those later on in the questions, Mr. Brass, if that's okay. All right, now, business passengers is the next subject that I want to ask you about. Again, slightly different context this time, though. Now, in your evidence in chief, you talked about things returning back to 2019 levels. You remember that, in 2019? Now, that comment calls me to remember something I'd read, and it's in the decarbonising transport, which is CD 9.134. I'll just get you some time to...
All right, on my CD 9.134, just a moment. Hang on. One, sorry, computer's on the go slow. Just a second.
It's all right. We're all used to this now. It requires patience.
It is loading. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Right, we're there.
I have terrible trouble at home because my sons keep playing Call of Duty in the middle of conferences and indeed court appearances, and I fall off the internet because they're.
My daughter at 6 has not quite got to that stage yet, but
she'll get there. Right, now page 21 of the PDF, please.
Just one moment. Yes.
This is in the introduction to decarbonising transport. Of course, this document was published on the 14th of July of this year, the week before this inquiry opened. Same day, I think, as the Jet Zero consultation started. Page 21 of the PDF, we're in the introduction, and it says at the top of the page, this is from government, last year we commissioned research, see part 2, to understand the impact of COVID-19 on current and future travel choices. It now seems likely some of the necessary short-term changes brought about by the pandemic, including the rise of home working, could remain for the longer term and could become permanent shifts in travel habits. This has created additional uncertainty for projecting forward transport usage and potential carbon emissions. It seems highly unlikely that the demand, patterns, timings, and modal choices of transport users across all forms of transport will simply return to those of 2019. You see that?
I can see that.
And this document, Decarbonising Transport, addresses aviation too, doesn't it?
It includes within its aviation, yes, but obviously its remit is a great deal wider.
Yeah. So there's the government saying a week before the inquiry starts, in its plan for decarbonising transport, it thinks it's highly unlikely, Mr. Brass, that the demand, patterns, timings and modal choices of transport users across all forms of transport will simply return to those of 2019. That's the... we can contrast that, can't we, with the view you expressed in your evidence in chief. You disagree with that statement by government, don't you?
I would say that the statement by government is a very broad comment, ultimately. I would say that I was making a very specific comment in relation to the level of business travel by 2030, which is obviously a substantial distance in the future. Whether the patterns that get us to that point are literally the same as 2019, no, they probably won't be. Or will there be changes in timings? Yes, almost certainly. Do I fundamentally think that we won't get back to 14% business travel by 2030? No, I don't. I think we will get there. I think that statement there is making a very, very broad point across a wide range of modes at the end of the day, and across a wide range of different things. I don't think it takes away from the specific point being made about business travel and the level of business travel in 2030.
Fine, I'll put the point, thank you. Right, now, you also made a point in your evidence in chief about the York Aviation study relating to the city. Do you remember that one? It's
Yes.
I think
yes.
is it CD 1314? Is that the right reference? I think that's. I don't know that we necessarily have to get it up to look at it. The point you made was that because it's looking at the city, it was looking at a different kind of economy than the economy we find in North Somerset, the west of England, the southwest, South Wales area. That was your point.
Well, no, that's not quite what I said. I said that it was not necessarily representative of, but yes,
not
I
necessarily representative of. Okay. I just want to then just look at your forecasting proof, if we may, page 54, just to see how you characterise that study when you referred to it previously. Your paragraph 4.9.9, page 54 of your forecasting proof.
I'm sorry, I've got my report on the wrong one. Just a second. Yes.
This is where you made your point that we've already discussed, that individuals may travel less for business, but more individuals will travel. I'm not interested in that. It's the next sentence. In this regard, it's perhaps helpful to consider the findings of previous research undertaken by York Aviation for the City of London in relation to the importance of air services for the city economy. And you then go on to describe some of the conclusions in the York Aviation study. So in your forecasting proof, you described that study as helpful, but now you seem to be sort of walking away from it a bit, Mr. Brass. Am I getting the wrong end of the stick?
I think you are slightly, Mr. Taylor, yes.
Right.
I mean, I think it's helpful in making a generic point about recovery of business travel and how people behaved after the global financial crisis. In terms of the absolute minutiae of how many people go to meetings as a proportion of the total business travel, it is obviously probably less helpful because it is a different structure of the economy.
Okay.
We are looking at a very specific sector at that point and a very specific area. But at a general level, I think it is helpful. It's not necessarily helpful in relation to the specifics in terms of the number of meetings people go to.
All right, just so that we get this clear then, you've produced no evidence that identifies the purpose of business travellers in flying from Bristol Airport?
No, I have not.
No. And you've adduced no evidence which establishes any difference in the purpose of travel of business travellers flying out of Bristol from the pattern that we see in CD 1314, in other words, 80% of them flying for meetings. You've got no evidence? No. Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. Let's move on then. I think we've established already that the econometric model that you produced of passenger demand isn't based upon any assumptions regarding particular route growth or particular change in the frequency of flights to existing routes. That's right, isn't it?
It doesn't take into account particular flights, no.
Yeah. All right, thank you. That's helpful. Now, we've also established, I think you'll agree with this, that business passengers are not as price sensitive as leisure passengers.
That's correct, yes.
And so, essentially, business passengers are prepared to pay more to travel than leisure passengers will.
On an individual destination basis, yes.
Yeah. So, in a capacity-constrained airport, where there's business passenger demand, generally speaking, a business passenger will displace a leisure passenger because they'll pay more to travel.
On an individual flight,
Yeah.
potentially, yes.
Right. Now, your econometric model, as I understand it, assumes that the same elasticities apply up to the point where Bristol Airport is capacity constrained in the do-nothing scenario. And then they apply those same elasticities beyond to 2030 in the do-something. Is that right?
That is correct.
In other words, your model does not address the fact that in a capacity-constrained airport where there's business passenger demand, business passengers will still fly because they will outbid leisure travellers on price.
It does, but it doesn't do it at the growth rate level. The desire to travel, the need to travel created by economic growth, or whatever else, will be reflected in the growth rate model. How business passengers behave underneath that is within the allocation model, which includes elasticities which would price off business travellers more slowly than leisure travellers.
You see, my understanding is that you have not presented evidence that established that business passenger demand would in fact be constrained in the do-nothing scenario.
I'm not sure I understand your question there.
Okay, I'll try again. You've not presented any evidence that establishes that business passenger demand would not outbid leisure passengers in the do-nothing scenario.
I'm not sure that's the case. That's within the form.
We've just explored it, Mr. Brass. You accept that, generally speaking, business passengers are prepared to pay more than leisure, and in a capacity-constrained airport, business passengers will outbid leisure travellers, and so will displace those leisure travellers in that capacity-constrained context. My question was that you've not presented any evidence that establishes that that would not happen in the do-nothing scenario. That's right, isn't it?
Yes. No. If you could turn to my rebuttal proof on... sorry, let me just find the right place for you. I've now lost me. There we go. I think that's it. My rebuttal proof on socioeconomics.
Yep.
Let me just find the right page for you. As we discussed this in relation to Mr. Ciro's point on growth resulting in the airport becoming more leisure focused at page 13, paras 2.2.26 through to paras 2.2.27. What we've talked about there is what would happen if the airport were to become constrained. And obviously we need to consider both the demand side and the supply side in this instance. Mr. Ciro made the point, I believe, that he believed that the airport would become, if it were constrained, would become more business focused, and would offer up more opportunities for business travel because of the point you've just made, that their business travels would outbid leisure. We presented evidence there that actually you need to consider the supply side. Certainly that at regional airports, airlines will not behave in that way because they will not put on the route in the first place. They will tend to put on more leisure-focused routes, which are more revenue intensive for them, and that ultimately that will lead to potentially actually a decline in leisure in business passenger percentage in a constrained world. If you look at where are we? Let me just find my relevant chart. Figure 2 on page 15. This is precisely the point that we're making here. As you can see, what we've used there is the CAA passenger survey to demonstrate that at UK regional airports, the percentage of business travellers on routes versus the revenue per flight. So the more profitable, higher revenue flights for airlines at regional airports are the core leisure routes, the ones that we can see to the left-hand side there. So what will happen in the event of constraint is that airlines will focus on those more leisure-focused routes, and business travellers will not use that airport because they have not got the routes that they need. And just to sort of, I know you pointed to this chart yourself the other day in relation to the percentage of business passengers at Heathrow Airport, which I think ultimately supports the point I'm just making. I think we can all agree that Heathrow Airport is probably about the most constrained airport in the world. It is 99% full. And at the same time, by your logic, business passenger percentage at the airport should be rising. It is not. The reason that is happening is because airlines are not putting on the services that their business passengers require. They have focused increasingly over the years on longer haul segments, which have larger aircraft sizes, have lower business components, and hence you're actually seeing a rise in the level of percentage of business travel at the airport.
Or Mr. Brass, in the Heathrow case, the reason business demand is falling is because less business trips are being made because people are using alternate technologies to communicate, and that companies are cutting back on travel in order to maximise profit. That's an alternate way of looking at it, isn't it?
It is an alternate way of looking at it, but in my understanding, I would need to check the figures to be sure, but I think the level of business travel is still rising. It is just falling as a percentage, I believe.
Right. Now let's come back to the point that I was putting to you. I put to you that you haven't presented in the do-nothing scenario an analysis which demonstrates, using your modelling, that business passenger demand would be constrained.
No, our modelling shows that it would the business strategy percentage would be broadly similar.
Your answer to my point just now, taking me to that part in your rebuttal,
Along with what I've just showed you,
was to talk about airline route choices, right?
True. Yes.
Yeah. And your model doesn't look at route choices, does it?
No, it doesn't. No,
Right.
It doesn't.
So, to come back to my point, whether in the do-nothing scenario business passenger demand would be constrained or would simply grow as a proportion of total passengers by displacing leisure travel is not something that your model investigates, is it?
No.
Right. Thank you. And Mr. Ciro's balanced view, that assumes that business passengers will displace leisure passengers in a capacity-constrained airport, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. And so, in that scenario, the same business passengers fly in the do something as fly in the do nothing.
In Mr. Ciro's scenario, yes.
Because in the do nothing, the business passengers outbid the leisure passengers on price and they still fly. And the net consequence of that is that the net economic impact of do something and do nothing in respect of business passengers of granting consent for the expansion of Bristol Airport would be zero. That would be right, wouldn't it?
In Mr. Ciro's scenario, yes, that would be correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. On that basis, the growth in do something that associated with the do something case, the 2 MPPA, would be growth associated simply from additional leisure passengers flying, either those displaced in the do nothing scenario or those who represent induced demand. Correct?
In Mr. Ciro's scenario, yes, that would be correct.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm right, aren't I, that your economic impact assessment, CD 2.22, does not take any account of the displacement of leisure passengers by business passengers in a 10 MPPA constrained Bristol Airport. That's correct, isn't it?
Only insofar as our analysis suggests that the percentage of business passengers will be brought the same.
Yes. So
yes.
Yeah. So as you go forward, you assume effectively the same relationship between business passengers and leisure passengers.
Yeah.
That relationship doesn't change in a constrained airport to reflect the fact that business passengers will outbid leisure passengers on price. That's where we get to, isn't it? Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah.
The reason it does not is because our forecast did not suggest that would happen, and for the reasons I've just discussed with you now. And
so your economic impact assessment, the one in CD 222, does not take account of displacement of leisure passengers by business passengers in a 10 MPPA constrained airport, does it?
I'm not sure that we're entirely talking in the same terms here. Our assessment is based on the traffic forecasts, which have looked at a 12 MPPA and a 10 MPPA world. In both cases, the business passenger percentage is forecast to be broadly the same, at around 14%.
Right. And because of that, Mr. Brass, the point I'm putting to you that is correct. Your economic impact assessment does not take account of the displacement of leisure passengers by business passengers in a 10 MPPA constrained airport. That's right, isn't it?
It is. We do not say that happens. So that is, in that sense, yes, you are correct.
Yes. Okay.
But we do not have evidence that it would happen. Is my point.
Right. Okay. If it's right that business passengers will still travel in the constrained airport because they will outbid leisure passengers, and those passengers will still travel in the unconstrained scenario, in other words, there's no net difference between do nothing and do something, then there would also be no net impact on business connectivity from granting permission for the expansion of Bristol Airport either. That would be right too, wouldn't it?
It would depend on how you define business connectivity, but if you're saying the number of passengers is the same, in your world, yes, that would be correct.
And so, because you've not looked at the extent to which business passengers would displace leisure passengers in a constrained Bristol Airport, it must follow that you've not established that the grant of planning permission for the expansion sought at this appeal will give rise to any increase in business connectivity.
But I think as we've just established, Mr. Taylor, the forecasts we have done have looked at this. They do look at the trade-off between business and leisure passengers. That's what I've just explained.
Right, okay, well, we can all look back and see your explanation. Now, Mr. Ciro also explored an alternate view, his optimistic view.
He did. Yes.
And in that, he was looking at what could happen if business passenger demand was subject to a level of constraint in the do-nothing scenario. That's what he was looking at, wasn't it?
I thought he was looking at the differential between business travel and leisure travel growth rates.
Ah, you see, his optimistic scenario looks at a different view. In other words, that business passenger demand in its entirety would not displace leisure passenger demand. That's why he called it his optimistic view.
Okay, well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's carry on.
He made an assumption, as he explained, and he assumed that the differential growth rate between business and leisure passengers would double. In other words, there would be an element of constrained business passenger demand in a constrained airport. That's what it looks like,
yes.
Isn't it?
That would be the implication of what he's done, yes.
All right. Thank you. That's very helpful. Let's move on to look at elasticities, Mr. Brass.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Ciro's proof, please. His page 21 is where I want to go next. And this is the YouGov poll.
Yeah.
Now, this was conducted in June of 2021?
Was it?
I think it says footnote 8.
It says accessed in June 2021. I believe it was undertaken in December and January, if I remember rightly.
Okay, fine. Accessed, yes, fine. We know from this, don't we, that that for business passengers, it's generally the employer that makes the decision about whether an employee flies or not.
I suppose in large organisations,
Yeah.
probably, but I would say in smaller organisations that's probably not quite so true.
There are lots of self-employed too, of course. You know.
Well, indeed, yes, I being one of them, and I believe yourself, Mr. Taylor, as well.
I'm self-employed, and I have a particularly difficult boss who never lets me fly anywhere. Well,
I've got one of them too.
But she's at home at the moment, so that's okay. Moving on from that point, let's the YouGov poll, as I understand it, shows that 60%, for 60% of respondents, this is the point that goes over the page,
Yeah.
asked how restrictions on flying had impacted on productivity. 60% said it had no impact. And I think there's a typo, isn't it? It should be 12% reported that productivity had improved.
Yes.
So 72% said not flying had no adverse impact on productivity.
Yes.
I mean,
28% did.
Right. But on that basis, an employer who is dealing with employees that are either more productive or where there's no impact on productivity will not want them flying again, will they?
I think it entirely depends on the volume of flying that's sorry, the volume requires. Sorry, let me start that sentence again. It's gone very badly. It's what we're talking about here is a point in time now. What we need to be thinking about is what happens in the future. Yes, obviously, people do not want to do things that are not productive. But if as we've just said, 28% have found this is actually being less productive. I would, notwithstanding the point that this is undertaken in the middle of a pandemic, and we're probably not actually sure what the long-term impacts on productivity would be anyway, it doesn't change the fact that in the future we would still expect demand to grow along with economic growth.
All right, thank you. I think that's all I need to put to you on that aspect, given the questions I put to you the first time round, as it were.
Indeed.
Let's move on to look at displacement, please.
Yeah.
Now, it's right, isn't there, that there is no policy, either at a national or local level, that supports economic growth at Bristol ahead of economic growth at other airports in the UK, is there?
No, not that I'm aware of it.
And it's also right, I think this is right, that all areas of the UK seek economic growth as an objective.
I would be very surprised if there are any that don't. No.
I mean, I was going to ask you whether you're aware of any part of the UK which adopts the attitude, don't come here, we've got enough investment and jobs, thank you very much. But
I must say, I've in 20 odd years of doing these things, I have never come across one that says no. I think that is fair.
All right, thank you. Now, in relation to displacement, the questions I'm asking you are put on the basis of the model that you've presented, which has not been the subject of the level of scrutiny that the council wishes to have. So the evidence that the questions I'm putting are given with that caveat. In the context of displacement and in the context of this inquiry, we're looking at public interest outcomes of a private sector investment, aren't we? We're looking at the do something and do nothing, but from a public interest perspective. Yeah?
We're looking at it from the perspective of a private sector investment and what that brings to the economy around the study areas we're looking at, yes.
Yes, in the public interest.
We're looking at it from the public interest, but does not necessarily look at it the same way as we would look at a public sector intervention, no.
Right, okay. Now, when you've looked at displacement, my understanding is that you've not included any displacement at the North Somerset or West of England levels in your assessment. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is because there are, sorry, let me just explain why these.
Okay.
We take the view that if you move demand from Bristol Airport to Cardiff, Exeter, wherever it may be, then the economic activity associated that will move to those other airports. There are no other airports in North Somerset or the West of England.
Right. Okay, well, let's just explore that rationale, if we may. I want to take you to CD 208, 2.08, please, page 40.
Sorry. Oh yeah, got it. No worries.
I think I've just lost it myself there. I clicked on the cross instead of. Let me bring it up. Sorry, you have to forgive me for a second whilst I get it myself. There we go. I think it's PDF page 40.
I'm there.
Let me just check I've got the right. And it's figure 4.3. Hoping as we got on that page. No.
No,
it's actually page 40 in the document itself. Forgive me.
All
Which is
right.
page 48 of the PDF.
Thank you.
This shows a distribution of on-site employees at Bristol Airport.
Yes.
And we can see here, can't we, that the reason why direct benefits relating to employment at the airport are reported at each of the different spatial levels, North Somerset, West of England, South West and South Wales, is because of the fact that employees are present at each spatial level, as we can see from that figure.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, so employees travel from South Wales to work at Bristol Airport, don't they?
Yes, it would appear so.
And there's no evidence at this inquiry that shows that residents of North Somerset or within the authorities in the west of England don't commute the other way and work at Cardiff Airport.
No, there is no evidence on that. No.
And we know, don't we, that there's a supply chain in the west of England that supports the aviation sector.
We do.
And you've not presented evidence that if Cardiff was to expand, then it wouldn't employ people residents in North Somerset or the west of England, and that it wouldn't use similar supply chains to those supporting Bristol Airport.
No, we haven't presented evidence of that. We've made the assumption that if you move those operations to Cardiff Airport, the great majority of people who are employed within those operations will be in and around Cardiff, and also the supply chain will reflect Cardiff's location.
But given your agreement to those propositions, Mr. Brass, it is simply not reasonable, is it, to assume that there's no displacement at the North Somerset and West of England geographic levels?
I think within a stylised model of what we are looking at, I think we have made the assessment that those impacts will be transferred within the region. We do not have any evidence to suggest that they are likely to be large numbers of people working in North Somerset, so living in North Somerset and working at Cardiff Airport. We don't have that. We do not have an understanding of Cardiff Airport supply chains. We have made that assessment to be at a regional level.
All right, thank you. Now, in terms of the levelling up agenda, we heard from Mr. Ciro that the government's decided to do that at the local authority level, hasn't it?
They have, yes.
Yeah. And we can note too that the levelling up agenda is something that has arisen since the consideration of your client's application for planning permission by officers and by the planning committee. Yeah. Okay. And the basis on which the levelling up fund of £4.8 billion is going to be distributed is via a ranking of local authorities from 1 to 3, where 1 is the highest priority and 3 is the lowest. And you accept, don't you, that in the west of England area, 3 of the local authorities are at level 2 and 1 is at level 3?
Yes. Yes, I mean, Mr. Ciro gave this evidence in his evidence. I have no reason to think he is wrong.
Okay. And you accept that Cardiff is level 1?
I accept that Cardiff is level 1, yes.
I mean, it's right, isn't it, Mr. Brass, that levelling up and the levelling up agenda can't be seen simplistically as encouraging investment in all locations other than London and the South East. That's not what it's about, is it?
I think you're asking me a general question, and I'll give you what my answer on. I think levelling up is, the clue is in the title. It is about trying to elevate all areas. Yes, some, Cardiff being one of them, is required of more help than others. others being potentially the west of England. I don't disagree with that. What I'm saying is that it is not about constraining growth in any particular area to support somebody else. I'm saying it's about trying to level up across the country, but yes, some of the areas need more attention than others.
Right, okay. You talk about constraining growth, I talk about refusing planning permission. But we'll gloss over the semantics. Now, in terms of the interrelationship of the various airports in terms of the catchments of demand that they meet,
Yes.
just want to address that, if we may. Now, I think when you gave your evidence previously, you talked about Cardiff Airport's catchment mostly being the sea, and I just want to explore that comment with you, if I may, by reference to Mr. Ciro's page 33, and to the 90-minute drive time zones for Bristol and Cardiff airports identified by York Aviation in 2014.
Indeed. Just a moment, let me just get to the right page. 33, did you say?
Page 33 of Mr. Ciro's proof, yes. Figure 6.1.
That's the one, yeah, I've got it.
Yeah. We can see a significant overlap of the catchments between Bristol and Cardiff, can't we?
We can, yes.
Right.
Well, hang on just a moment. We see a significant overlap in the drive time catchment. It does not necessarily tell you where passengers come from.
Right, okay. Thank you. Right. Now, Mr. Ciro, when he gave his evidence, explained that 21% of passengers at Bristol come from Wales. Is that a figure you recognise?
I don't have the figures to hand, but I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Okay.
It sounds about right.
Thank you. Now, in terms of the Exeter position, Mr. Ciro at 6.2.3 produced identified the degree of competition between Bristol and Exeter by reference to an OFT, the Office of Fair Trading report, examining alleged abuse of a dominant position by Flybe.
Yes.
And the OFT's view was that the results show a large degree of overlap between the two catchment areas.
Yes.
Using the 20% threshold, a significant proportion of passengers at Exeter Airport appear to be exposed to competition from Bristol Airport. And so, based on that, the OFT considered that there seems likely to be competition between airlines at both airports on these routes when considered in aggregate.
Yes.
Right, so we can see that. Now, in terms of the destinations served by the airports, again, Mr. Ciro gave evidence in his when he presented last week that 77% of destinations served by the four airports, the ones we were just looking at, Bournemouth, Cardiff, Exeter, Newquay, are also served by Bristol Airport.
Yes.
Okay. He said that the percentage of destinations at each airport also served by Bristol were as follows: for Bournemouth 96%, Cardiff 78%.
Right.
Exeter.
Sorry, Miss Sophie, can you just repeat the last bit? Sorry, you just broke up for a second.
He said that the percentage of destinations at each airport also served by Bristol were as follows: Bournemouth was 96%, Cardiff 78%, Exeter 77%, and Newquay 52%. Those are not figures that you challenge, as I understand it.
I have no reason to believe they're incorrect now.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of the displacement model that you produced, The displacement, as we've established, is investigated at the South West and South Wales level.
Yes.
And your model shows that of the residents of that region, 330,000 would use Cardiff if Bristol isn't expanded, 200,000 would use Exeter, 50,000 Newquay, 30,000 Bournemouth. So
Yes.
those are all elements of growth in passenger throughput at those airports that would not happen on the basis of your model if permission is granted for the appeal proposal. That's right, isn't it?
It depends slightly on which way around you look at it, but yes, the numbers are correct. Those are the numbers that would go for those airports, yes.
Okay. 570,000 would fly from airports outside of the South West and South Wales region, according to your model,
Yeah.
of which 180,000 are assumed to fly from Heathrow.
Yes.
Now, Heathrow is a more expensive airport to fly from than Bristol, isn't it?
It is.
And it offers very different types of destinations to the leisure destinations offered at Bristol.
It offers about 100, in normal times it offers about 170 destinations, of which there are a wide range. It offers leisure destinations, it offers business destinations, it offers short haul, it offers long haul. It offers all those things, which is part of the point why it is attractive to passengers.
Given that Bristol is primarily a leisure airport, why is it that 180,000 people are allocated to Heathrow in your passenger allocation model, given the different type of destinations and the increased price of flying from Heathrow?
Well, a lot of it will depend on where they live, ultimately. If they are relatively near to Bristol, for instance, then travelling to Exeter, Newquay, or Bournemouth, or indeed Cardiff in many respects, is actually fairly irrational. It's quite a long way away. Heathrow may not be closer, but it's not that much different. It does offer a wide range of destinations. I suspect it probably, I don't know, I haven't checked against the networks of Bournemouth, Exeter, Newquay and Cardiff, but I suspect it will probably offer many of the destinations that they do anyway. Yes, it will be slightly more expensive, I agree. It will probably offer services at different times of day or on different days of the week, which are convenient for people. The people in question may actually be relatively price insensitive. They may actually be live closer to Heathrow than they do to Bristol. We don't know. We do know that over 180,000 have done it. But the point is, you can't simply say that doesn't make sense. You need to think about what the rationale is for it. Those airports are relatively small. They have relatively few services. They don't have a great level of frequency. They're fairly peripheral from a lot of Bristol's catchment area. Heathrow, for it, is rather the opposite. It's a global hub airport which is easily accessible down the M4 with a wide range of services at high frequency. Yes, they are more expensive in general, I agree. But no, it represents a very sensible and very reasonable option for many, many passengers.
Okay. Thank you. The last element of the passenger allocation model, of course, is that 760,000 trips that are made if planning permission is granted for the appeal scheme are not made if it's refused. We'll come back to the implications of that. But let's just have a look at the impact on Cardiff a little bit more. 330,000 people would use Cardiff if permission is refused. Mr. Ciro has estimated the amount of displacement at Cardiff on his table 6.3, which is in his proof at page 38.
One moment. Yes. I'm there.
And he's got a range of between 39 and 57 million GVA.
Yes.
627 to 79.
Sorry, can I just check? Are you looking at the original version or the old version?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the old version.
Sorry, I'm looking at the old version as well, so that's all right.
I think was that
mean,
yes, that table has been updated, hasn't it?
Mr. Taylor, I don't as yet have the updated table, so the old version is better. But I'm just trying to find where you're at. That's all.
It has been updated, and it makes very little difference. I think it makes a 1 million difference to the GVA at Cardiff.
That's fine. I mean, I presume we're talking about principles rather than details, aren't we? So,
we are.
Yeah, let's talk in principles then.
So just so I follow, are we looking at what I think was INQ 10, which was Mr. Say's first revision?
No, I'm looking at the document that was handed round this morning.
Right,
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, it's
I
my
said
fault.
INQ 10, I meant INQ 11, but
I'm looking at what was handed around this morning.
Okay.
Apologies, I don't have that one, but
Okay, well, I'll read the numbers out, Mr. Brass, and it makes precious little difference, to be frank. The updated table 6.3 in the document handed around this morning has, for Cardiff Airport, South West and South Wales region, a GVA impact of displacement of between 40 and 58 million. Jobs 635 to 802 and FTEs 515 to 647 of the ranges that are provided.
sorry, Cardiff Airport. My apologies, Mr. Taylor. I'm lost as to where you are in the table.
Okay, so table 6.3, there's a Cardiff Airport column.
Yes, I've got that.
And
First,
if you come right down the bottom to the South West and South Wales.
Oh, right, sorry,
row,
I was looking further up. I do apologise.
okay,
Go on.
and I just read out the ranges for GVA
Yeah.
jobs and FTEs. Okay.
Yes, I've got that. Yeah, I've got the 57 to 39 in mind, 795 to 627, 641 to 508. Fine. Yeah.
Okay. Now, so that is that's the impact as he's identified it at that geographical region.
Yeah.
Now, you don't present any equivalent assessment, do you?
For South West and South Wales.
Yeah. For Cardiff Airport.
No, no, we don't individually
No.
at Cardiff. No.
Okay. Right. Now, I want to ask you some questions about what I've called critical mass.
Right.
And Mr. Ciro explained, do you remember, by reference to the document prepared for Bristol Airport relating to the potential for charging to be devolved to the Welsh Assembly?
Remember? Yes.
And he took us to a couple of paragraphs in that. We can go to them if you want to. But in essence, his point was that the argument that Bristol was making was that to allow devolvement in the charging would make Cardiff potentially more attractive than Bristol, that Cardiff would experience a boost in growth and Bristol would experience a reduction in growth, with the result that over time Cardiff would become more attractive, take greater market share, expand its services more easily, and so on and so on and so on. So there's a synergistic effect of, in essence, giving Cardiff that sort of market advantage. That's what the airport was objecting to. That's a fair way of putting it, isn't it?
I think from memory, yes, that's broadly correct. Yes.
Now, let's turn it round the other way. Bristol's a larger airport than Cardiff and indeed any of the other 4 airports that we were looking at, isn't it? Already.
That's correct. Yes.
And as we've seen on the basis of your own allocation model, if permission were refused, the consequence would be that those other airports would grow more than the growth that they would undergo if permission is granted.
That's correct, yes.
And so if Bristol Airport expands, then the very point that Bristol Airport was making against Cardiff will arise in reverse. Bristol Airport expansion will result in Cardiff experiencing a reduction in growth compared to the do-nothing scenario.
There's a very, very crucial difference in the situation, though, isn't there? Ultimately, what we were talking about in terms of the previous report in relation to the devolution of air passenger duty to Wales was the potential for the Welsh Government to make an intervention into the market to essentially give every single passenger, every single passenger a reduction in fare of £7 at that airport by essentially removing APD. That is not the situation we're looking about here. That is about a distortion of competition by changing the tax status of one airport compared to another. That is not what we're talking about here.
But
what we're talking about here, Mr. Taylor, let me finish if you don't mind. I think what we're talking about here, everything remains on a level competitive playing field. All we're asking is that a planning permission is removed. There is no change in the underlying market conditions that is being looked at here. It is a completely different situation.
The consequence of granting planning permission would be to make the airport, which is already the larger, become more attractive. It would make it harder for Cardiff and the other airports to sustain growth in terms of passengers and routes compared to the position if expansion of Bristol Airport were refused. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that is correct. They would grow more. My point is that we operate in a competitive market. That is just the workings of the market. Removing APD to give your airport an advantage is a distortion of competition. It is not the same thing at all. The fact that future traffic is not owned by anyone, there is nothing to stop Cardiff, Exeter, Newquay or Bournemouth competing for the traffic that we suspect that we forecast will go to Bristol. They could do any number of things to try and compete and to actually stop Bristol from getting to 12 million. They could try and do that. We don't think it will happen. Our forecasts do not suggest that it will happen, but there is nothing to stop them from doing that.
To grant planning permission for the expansion of Bristol Airport would be contrary to the levelling up agenda, which we looked at before, which ranks Cardiff ahead of the west of England in terms of need for levelling up support. That's right, isn't it?
It ranks it. No, Mr. Taylor, it is not right. Ultimately, as we've already said, levelling up is about levelling up. Yes, Cardiff may need additional support. Fine, Cardiff should have additional support in that case. It does not mean and does not anywhere say that you should therefore constrain Bristol Airport to give it that advantage. It is about levelling up, not levelling down.
If planning permission is granted for the expansion of Bristol Airport, on your own passenger allocation model, Cardiff and the other airports are levelled down, aren't they?
Sorry?
Cardiff and the other airports are levelled down because they don't get the GVA, the jobs, the FTE that they would otherwise get if planning permission for Bristol Airport expansion were refused.
No, I don't agree. I simply don't agree with that. All that removing the current planning restriction does is enable competition within the market. That's all it does. It does not in any way level down anybody else.
It results in those airports not having the passenger throughput that they would otherwise have on your own model, Mr. Brass.
I don't disagree.
Sorry, I've not finished the question. That must mean that they are the subject of adverse economic impact compared to the position that would otherwise occur if permission for Bristol Airport expansion is granted. That's right, isn't it?
In the terms you put it then, to tell you yes, it is correct. They would grow more. But my point is that is not inconsistent with the levelling up agenda.
Right. So you think that giving rise to an adverse economic impact on an area like Cardiff, which ranks ahead of the west of England in terms of the levelling up agenda identification process of need, is consistent with the levelling up agenda, do you? Is that really your position? Right, okay, thank you, that's very helpful. Sir, I think that's a good moment. I've got some more questions on displacement to follow, but looking at the time and the hungry faces around the room, I think it's time to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Should we take an hour then? Mr. Brass, this shouldn't be much of a problem since you're not physically there. But
I know what you're saying. Yes, it's fine.
Yes. Okay. Let's come back at 2 o'clock then. Thank you. The inquiry is adjourned.